Good morning. Boy, we certainly had a lot of rain this week, but the warm weather combined with that rain, it has brought the flowers out. You know, growing up in the north, we rarely saw flowers prior to Easter. I always loved it coming here in the south because it's nice to have spring show up when the calendar says it should. You know, up north, it's another month before it gets nice out. And it's always nice to have the Easter season come. And this year it's special. We get to celebrate together. So I'm continuing my series I call Huh. And the Huh moments for the next 2 weeks probably aren't going to seem all that unusual to you, because we're going to be talking about the Passion Week and the resurrection. And you know, growing up in America, especially in the 1960s, the Easter season was just part of the culture. We started there with Mardi Gras, went to Ash Wednesday. Everybody gave up something for Lent. Palm Sunday came along, Good Friday, and then, of course, Easter morning. You know, Easter, that was a big celebration, and it was certainly time to get that new outfit out, because we knew that Jesus was alive and that had changed everything. But, you know, outside Christianized Western culture, there's a lot of questions about Jesus. And that's where we're going this week for our Huh questions. So it may not seem all that dramatic to some of us in the West, but it would be different if we went out into the world of other cultures, right? They'd have a lot of questions. Why was Jesus' death all that important? Why did this information even make it out of the first century? This guy was a lowly Jewish carpenter from a tiny little nation. And all this focus on his death? The guy was a criminal, right? He died a brutal death. He was a bad person. I think this all must be myth would be a common answer. And this other stuff, rise from the dead, that's just too much for me. So our questions this week are going to be about Jesus, whether he's historical or not, and whether the claims of Christianity are historically accurate. So let's start by looking at the record. Obviously, the Gospels are the written records of the life of Jesus. And as we mentioned last week, we have 4 Gospels. And they tell the story basically of a 3-year time period of the life of Jesus. And they all culminate in the same event, which is what we celebrate this week. The event that 2,000 years ago, this unknown Jewish carpenter from the Galilee area was nailed to a cross, and the world was changed. So scholars agree, interestingly enough, the Gospels are reliable historical documents. In fact, the Gospels documents are probably some of the most reliable ancient documents. They all show very good evidence that the Gospels did occur. They're reliable records. And we have 2 first-person accounts, the book of Matthew and the book of John. These are first-person accounts. And the other 2 books, they're second-person accounts. For example, we discussed last week that Mark's gospel is Peter's account. Mark was Peter's scribe, and he wrote this gospel probably within 30 years of Jesus' death. Matthew's gospel, he was a first-hand observer. He was one of the apostles. He was the tax collector. He took some of Mark's material and expounded upon it. Then we have Luke. Luke, it's a second-hand gospel, but in his first few verses, he tells us his purpose in writing. He says, I'm writing to compile a narrative of things from eyewitnesses, to write an orderly account for you, Theophilus. So Luke's gospel is investigative journalism. Yes, it's secondhand, but he did the work. He did the work. And he probably completed his gospel around 62 AD. And we say that because he wrote both the book of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, and the last recorded event in the Acts of the Apostles occurs around 62 AD. And also, Luke does not write anything about two very important events that occurred just after that, probably by 65 AD. One event was Paul's crucifixion, and Paul was his traveling companion. And the second is an event we know happened, which was that Rome burned, and that then Nero persecuted the Jews, because that was in 65 AD. So there we have it. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, three Gospels, all telling a similar story, giving us a synopsis of Jesus' life. Now, we do have a fourth Gospel. That's John's Gospel. It's a little different, but John wrote it significantly later, maybe as late as 90 to 100 AD. And John is writing as a pastor. He's writing in Ephesus, they feel, and he's writing an evangelistic document. So he tells the same story about Jesus, but he has much different information there. But it's still the same basic story. So we have four documents about the life of Jesus that are remarkably consistent. And sure, we find some minimal inconsistencies and some stuff that's in one but not in the other. For example, last week we learned about the biblical streaker. Only Mark mentions this one. And then only Luke's gospel says that Pilate first sent Jesus to Herod to be tried, and then Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate. But perhaps Luke just figured that out after talking to all those eyewitnesses he did. And then only Matthew notes that Pilate's wife had a dream about Jesus, and that Pilate tried to actually wash his hands of the affair. And then Matthew, he also talks about a strange event, that the tombs were open when Jesus died. But again, Matthew was there, so maybe he had a unique perspective. But these are all really minor changes in details, right? They don't undermine the basic story. Even some embarrassing details are reported by the gospel writers. One of the most embarrassing details is, of course, Peter denying Jesus 3 times. So we do have these minor differences in the story, but they all tell the same story. And they all also tell us about one really embarrassing detail. And that is, when Jesus was arrested, all of his faithful followers fled. Even his closest friends ended up fleeing. And one of his closest friends, Peter, actually ended up denying him, denying that he even knew Jesus. So, as we look at the end of Jesus' life, one of the least head-scratching parts of the story is that the Romans put an innocent man to death. I mean, come on. This is the Roman world. The Roman world, they just did whatever they wanted to do. I mean, yeah, we think of beautiful, glorious Rome and all those fancy buildings, but we forget that the Roman Empire was built by the sword. I mean, that's how great empires are built, right? So Romans' peace and prosperity, it was built by brutality. I mean, people are out there in the Roman world out there singing, "Oh, let's give peace a chance," like John Lennon would. I mean, this is Rome. And the Roman authorities, they wanted to show their power. So putting a man to death in the first century is not that big of a deal. And again, has to have us wonder, why is so much written about that event? And it's also interesting that secular historians from the day mention Jesus' death. We have two big ones from the day. One is a Jewish historian, another one is a Roman historian. The Jewish historian is named Josephus, and he's the first century Jewish historian. He wrote a big book about all the events that occurred in Jewish history around the first century. He was born, Josephus was, around 37 AD. So he was born just a few years after Christ died. And he was a well-connected aristocrat and a military leader in Palestine. And he was the commander in Galilee of a little battalion. And he was there to document the first Jewish revolt against Rome around 66 AD. And Josephus, he's not a follower of Jesus, that's for sure. But he understood what was going on, and he certainly knew a lot of the early followers of Jesus because he lived amongst them. And Josephus mentions twice about Jesus in his writings. And he wrote his writings around 93 AD. There's one passage in his book that talks about Jesus' half-brother's death, James. And they note that he is the half-brother of Jesus, who is called Messiah. So he is recounting that people then said Jesus was the Messiah. And then he has a lengthier passage where he describes a man who did surprising deeds and a man who was condemned to death by Pilate. So this is a pretty good record about this unknown Jewish carpenter. There's another account of Jesus that appears in the Annals of Imperial Rome. And this was written by Tacitus. He was a first century historian and a Roman senator and a citizen of Rome. He wrote around 116 AD. He talks about the burning of Rome, and Tacitus mentions that Emperor Nero falsely blamed Rome's burning on Christians, and that Christians were followers of a guy named Christ who was put to death by Pontius Pilate, the procurator of Tiberius. You know, think of it. This is a Roman historian. He doesn't have Christian biases. He's just writing things out that happened. And he says that Jesus was executed by the governor of Judea. And also note that in Tacitus's writing, if he came across something that he wasn't quite sure if it was historically accurate, he would make a little notation. But there's no such notation about this information about Jesus. And then there's also a Roman governor called Pliny the Younger. And he noted that early Christians would sing hymns to Christ as if he was God. My point? No honest scholar thinks that Jesus is a made-up figure. They all believe he's historical. And this is my real moment for this week's teaching. Because did you know that back in 2015, just 5 years ago, the Church of England surveyed people in England about religious matters. And what did the survey reported? That English people said, people out of the West. It said that 22% of the people in England did not believe that Jesus was even a historical person. Doesn't that tell us a lot about modern culture? Doesn't that tell us a lot about the struggles that we're having? I mean, learned professors at universities accept a historical Jesus, but 22% of the people in England, in the West, don't think Jesus was a historical figure. They just think he's a myth. You know, and even out there in the Bible Belt, out where we are, there's a lot of people questioning the reality of Jesus, the historicity of Jesus, let alone questioning the main theological points of Easter week. That's all for me to conclude that we live in a lost world, Christian, and the skeptics are out there abound. And even the ones that accept a historical Jesus have a lot of questions out there about Easter week. Did you know some people question whether Pilate was a real historical figure? And they also question whether crucifixions really took place back then in first century Jerusalem. Well, it's interesting. You know what? The archaeological record that's unfolding, especially in the last 100 years, as archaeologists have been able to do more and more digs in and around Jerusalem, the archaeologists are supportive of the biblical record. There's skeptics out there asking questions, but the artifacts, they support the biblical record. For example, for years, they wondered about whether there was really this guy, Pontius Pilate. There was no archaeological evidence of him. And then they did find an inscription, maybe 50, 60 years ago, that had Pontius Pilate's name on it, on a big piece of stone. Some people question whether the crucifixions were really done in the first century. And then in 1968, during the excavation of a Roman-era tomb in Jerusalem, they found a 7-inch long nail driven through the bone of a person right at the heel, and it was attached to a small piece of wood. Evidence of a crucifixion, a first century crucifixion. Then, of course, we have people, did Jesus really die on the cross? You know, Muslims, they can't put Jesus on a cross. They think Jesus is a prophet from God, but they just think it would be blasphemous to put a prophet on a cross. But then we have the biblical record. And the biblical record says that there's Roman soldiers at the scene of the crucifixion and that they were in charge. And we do know some things about Roman soldiers. They were very good at following orders. And they knew how to kill somebody. And they knew the difference between life and death. So people might argue whether Christ really died on the cross, because that is an explanation for the resurrection, is that he never really died, that he just swooned up there. But come on, the biblical record, it's there. Does anybody honestly believe that the Roman centurions in charge of an execution let the guy live? So, remember that, Christian. Our faith is born in history. And that's where we'll leave it today as we close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for Christ dying on a cross. And we thank you that there's plenty of evidence to prove that that did really happen some 2,000 years ago. In your name, amen.